I'm a project leader of a common road to 2050 energy networks and policy. This is just a demonstration project. So the objective of this project is to produce a range of options for use of diverse range of energy resources in 2050 and to draw together an assessment of their benefits and challenges from technical and policy perspectives. Mainly is to understand the current challenges there, how these different energy sources like nuclear, fossil fuels, renewables and so on to match energy production to demand at any time. Also, we try to understand the main barriers, political integration, public acceptance, and we created some scenarios, and through these scenarios, we try to identify the key policy options. There are many questions. So what are the main needs of the UK? What are the economic goals? What industries do you need to support over the next 20 years? What are the investments needed? Which instruments we need? And what the government needs to do, and so on. The aim of the workshop from today is to identify the key emerging issues, to help confirm, refine the storylines for scenarios, and to provide a platform for communication with different stakeholders and with academic colleagues.
Two degrees Celsius and 450 ppm. Where did these come from? These numbers came from generations of scenarios using climate models. GCMs emerged in the 1980s and 90s, really to prominence as they began being able to replicate the 20th century in and around the late 80s and early 90s. If CO2 is the problem, if a warming planet is the problem, and you can identify a single culprit like CO2, you can create a market around it. If you can create a market around it, you can create a global deal on what that market would look like. And that has been the underlying rationale of climate politics for the last 2 decades, trying to seek a mitigation agreement, a global mitigation agreement that would lead to some form of binding targets and some way of pricing in the externality of climate change by simplifying everything down into a carbon equivalence and dollars. And essentially, to summarize, the focus has been on carbon and carbon mitigation for some good reasons, and there have been a range of scientific technical metrics used in order to digest everything down into these numbers of 450 ppm and 2 degrees centigrade. First, shale gas in particular in the last few years has really begun to change the equations around not only the energy scenarios going forward, but also the carbon calculations. The impacts of all of these new oil sources, these new carbon sources that have been discovered are incredibly significant. This is just one of the projections on how shale gas is going to be displacing other sources of gas production in the US. And of course, we're discovering just last week, the British Geological Survey released a new report talking about much greater shale gas resources in the UK than had been previously estimated. And we're seeing the rapid expansion of this graph becoming more and more colorful and moving more and more into the orange as more shale gas is developing. So when you think about the politics of it, world leaders get to show up in 2015 and say, we will reduce 20, 30%, whatever it is, by 2025. It's a nice near-term political win. It has all of the political connotations that one wants for a climate, but it comes with a big challenge. You're actually locking in quite a bit of infrastructure. If you shut off everything today, if you shut off all emissions, including sulfate, including carbon, this is where your temperature would equilibrate to. Now, this has some pretty significant implications for what your future projections are, particularly when you think about the committed emissions to the future.
We as a society entirely rely on the electricity, and that must be maintained in the future, whatever we'll do. What are the drivers for change in the 21st century? So first, let's talk about generation. From the power system point of view, what we are talking about? We are talking about replacing those big traditional power stations. Size will be all thermal power stations by smaller and uncontrollable, because you cannot tell wind when to blow, and stochastic power sources. Stochastic because you don't really know what will be doing tomorrow. You can guess it within 10% at the most. So that means there's a number of challenges. The first is the balancing challenge, but that balancing challenge, it means how to balance the wind when it doesn't blow. It's an economic challenge. It means how to do it in the most cost-effective way, but we know how to do it. And also about the control, how to optimize the whole thing. But it's not really a big technical challenge. It's just to get it right, to get it as cheap as possible. So balancing challenge, assuming business as usual, BAU. So the current balancing, we know exactly how to model any changes in demand, and it is done by the generation following the demand. Whenever demand changes, generation will follow it. And as the result of that, as I said, utilization of generation is about 55%, because installed capacity is about 120% of the peak demand, which means 120% of a dead period. It means the difference between deadline and whatever demand is there will give you an unused capacity. That graph starts from 20%, not from zero. That's why it's exaggerated. The difference is exaggerated. But if we look at the future, if we look at the intermittent generation, which in this country means mostly wind and a little bit of solar, although we are in the north of Europe, so perhaps solar is not such a big issue for us. Of course, wind is all over the place. This is a graph of wind generation as given by National Grid a few years back. And basically, it's totally stochastic. It's all over the place. So that means that the so-called capacity credit of wind, it means the amount to, how can you trust wind to be there when you need it at the time of the peak demand, is somewhere around 10% or thereabout at high penetrations. It all depends on the penetration of wind. So that means if we're replacing the traditional controllable power stations by intermittent generation, that means this is the installed capacity which we need at a high wind penetration. So the difference between this line and again our demand patterns increases. So that means that utilization drops about 25% from 55%. It means half. So that means that we have to do more clever than that. This is business as usual. It means if we do it the way as we do it at the moment, and we have to be more clever because at the end of the day, we, the customers, have to pay for the difference. In the world of politics, everything is about those different vectors which pulling the whole picture in different directions, and which politicians have to take into account is the security of supply, the price must be acceptable, and the climate change at the same time.
This is a bit the other energy policy triangle, which is a typical project management triangle, or indeed if you've ever had any building work done on your house, you'll know that there's a trade-off as well between time, cost and quality. In terms of time, it just strikes me that 2050 seems a long way away, but it's actually a very short space of time compared to the process of carbonisation that we have been through, which has been around 200 years, as was just explained. In terms of cost, if we're talking about 100 to 200 billion by 2020 for the UK, and then carry that on till 2050, you're talking about 10 or 20 billions a year pounds in the UK of investment. That seems quite a small figure, but it actually isn't a small figure at all, because if you take the total amount of investment in the UK economy in any particular year is around 200 to 250 billion. But a big chunk of that is actually replacing the capital stock that already exists. So you've actually got left at the end for net investment in the UK economy something like 50 to 100 million. So if we're taking up 10 to 20 billion a year in the energy sector, I think the conclusion has to be that you can't do that without having quite a profound effect on the wider economy. And I think, again, that's something that hasn't quite been appreciated, or if it is appreciated, isn't discussed. And quality, I think, is in terms of, have we reliably reduced greenhouse gas emissions? In terms of policy, I think we have to bear in mind what's the problem we're trying to solve. And the key issue I think I want to focus on a bit here is the difference between risk and uncertainty. So risk is something you can assess and measure in terms of the variability of primary fuel prices year by year. Whether coal's higher than gas 1 year, or gas higher than coal, carbon higher than carbon high or low, and then that's a risk, and that can be managed by market participants in forward markets, or just by good business decision making, and those sorts of things are present in lots of other sectors as well. The thing I think makes the energy sector a bit special is the uncertainty elements. So particularly in terms of the first 5 years, how much is it actually going to cost to build a nuclear power station? The current direction of policy is to try and, it seems to me, take a lot of the risk out of the investment decision. But my question, and it's an open question really, is does this focus on bankability? And really we're talking about bankability in terms of debt finance of investments. Does that actually discourage other potential investors. So are you actually chopping off a big chunk of the global wealth pool when you are looking at who is going to invest in these things? So that's one set of questions I think we have. And the second is a bit about customers. So the two Ronnies, that's Ronnie Corbett and Ronnie Barker, and John Cleese did this famous sketch in the 1960s about what it meant to be upper class, middle class and lower class. If you think about how you're distributing risks between those various classes, you have to be pretty careful about that, because anyone who's for example, anyone who's an electricity consumer in the UK is going to be a de facto equity participant in any of the CFD plant that gets built. So when the power price is high, you will get paid a dividend, and when the power price is low, you'll be asked for some more funding for that particular business. So you've turned into an investor in a particular type of asset. What kind of energy markets do we want? And there's a pretty wide choice. I mean, at present, we are trading in commodity type traded markets at the moment, and that's what we as an energy trading business know and recognise. You've got other types of approaches, really, a sort of central buyer managed approach, which is effectively where we're going in terms of the capacity mechanism. If it's implemented in this way, this is the sort of constructed capacity demand curve, which a variation of which is proposed for the UK. You can have a sort of tender franchise competition for the market. We believe in markets, and markets will facilitate the introduction of the new technologies that potentially are available.
Looking at the future role for gas, as Mark Twain remarked of his own death, there are perhaps rumours of its demise have been somewhat exaggerated, and we've seen a very different approach to the future of gas over the last year or so than perhaps we were hearing 6-7 years ago in terms of the policy agenda. The policy challenge is the big three. A smarter network. It's about moving away from a passive power flow to an active system where the customer can export additional energy that they do not need. One of the things that is going to be essential as we go forward is actually looking at how smarter networks can, and this narrative about smarter networks can enable the public to save money. And we are talking about billions. But the other side of that story is about how we empower the customer. And it is about how we ensure that the customer is part of this process.
This was just showing the sort of pipeline that would be needed if we were to meet longer term targets. This was the sort of progress that was needed to be taken by 2020 in terms of progressing different sets of technologies through the innovation process from research out through to deployment. They have their limitations in terms of the different time steps that are used, the different technology sets that can be put into the models, and the inputs and assumptions that go into those. So there are limitations there when you're dealing with a really numeric model. This was the Committee on Climate Change scenario, which was looking at 2030 and 50% renewables, and looking at some of the options of doing that through the different flexibility options. But again, it's not about taking just those blank outputs. It's around thinking, well, what does that mean? What are we going to have to do because of that, rather than just implementing policy? And so it's how we take that sort of analysis and translating it into policy, which I think is becoming more accepted now. It's more about that detail. And also it's beginning to influence the innovation agenda. I think it's questionable how energy system scenarios have influenced energy policy historically, if you look back at the Royal Commission's work and since then, and even more so how it's influenced energy innovation policy.
The World Energy Council is a membership organization based in London. We have about 3,000 members in our network in 95 countries, so a very broad representation. The idea is, when we do scenarios, is to deal with this issue of uncertainty. And as we move on, this, what we call the scenario funnel, widens actually. And for us, it was very important that we wanted our scenarios to be exploratory rather than normative. So in the first scenario, we assume that the world is market facilitated, it's driven by consumers, And the focus really is on achieving growth through low-cost energy. On the other hand, we have a government-led scenario that is more voter-driven, where the focus is on, let's call it national energy security, and national and regional measures to increase the share of renewables in the energy mix. So what you see here is the way how we did the modeling work. We looked at population as a key driver, GDP growth, technologies, resources, and different policies. And we have then taken those and quantified them using a linear programming optimization model. And so what we see here is the development of total primary energy supply over time up to 2050. The composition, basically, if we look at renewables, biomass, nuclear, gas, oil, and coal. And we can see on the left-hand side that coal really is there to stay. And that's, I think, one of the key messages, especially if we look at energy demand in India, in China, and maybe Africa as well. You can see that coal has a role to play. In Symphony, we would expect a more stable and quicker transition to renewables, and especially also more hydro in emerging countries, especially in Africa and Latin America. We have made different assumptions with regard to CCS, and clearly, I mean, CCS is one of them. There might be others, such as energy storage, and this is what we call in scenario terms wildcards. And you can clearly see the difference in the assumptions with regard to CCS and Jazz and Symphony. In the Jazz scenario, we assume that CCS will be ready at a commercial scale probably around 2035, but it is basically not adopted initially due to high cost and the relatively low carbon price. We would assume that CCS can be commercially used in enhanced oil recovery, and it will then be adopted more widely after 2040 probably. In the Symphony scenario, the picture is quite different. You will see a much higher take-up of CCS due to government intervention, basically, and government promotion of these technologies. And one of the assumptions that we have made is that CCS is increasingly required on coal new build, and it will also be used in enhanced oil recovery. In doing global scenarios is a very challenging task, and there are a lot of limitations, obviously, that go into the model as assumptions. But at the same time, I think it's important to start somewhere and to quantify these trends in order to substantiate the debate.
We review the latest studies based on the global energy scenarios and analyze the main differences between these scenarios. This graph shows you the scenarios suggested by these 6 studies for future global projection from 2020 to 2050. All these scenarios show that for 2020, the projections are closer to the present time. The 6DS, for example, from ETP is ranked first and has the highest CO2 emissions. In 2050, the 6DS projects the largest amount of CO2 emission. The World Energy Council Symphony and GEA Efficiency and Supply has similar projection. The Greenpeace reference continues to preserve all these its high scores in emissions based mainly on the current policies. Shell, GEA, ExxonMobil and Greenpeace is projecting an increase of primary energy in the future. For 2030, the ExxonMobil records a peak in the energy demand. We try to illustrate different participants of the resources in the energy mix. For 2030 and especially 2050, all the scenarios integrate an increased use of renewables and biomass. In particular, the Greenpeace revolution scenarios includes the largest amount of renewables compared to all the other scenarios. And between 2020 and 2050, it was observed a reduction in the use of oil and coal. And for natural gas remains the main contributor in the energy production in the majority of these scenarios. We break down the renewable resources in the world energy system by 2050. We observe that in most scenarios, in Shell, GEA, Greenpeace, Revolution, the solar power has the main role in the global energy production from renewables. Hydro also continues to play an important role in the electricity generation. We compare their main assumption, so the world population, the GDP and fuel prices. The energy projection in all reports are highly sensitive to underlying assumption about the GDP growth. We look at fuel prices for coal and oil. So these were projected to be lower than the real data in 2010.
Overall, we assessed, or in the process of assessing, 19 different studies with horizons between 2010 and 2050. The particular three we picked that were completed in 2006 are the ILEX study for WWF, the DTI study for the UK government, and a Friends of the Earth study. So the ILEX study and the Friends of the Earth study both look at producing an energy system, or electricity system in particular, with no nuclear capacity at all from today, well, 2006. The ILEX study has a business as usual scenario and a power switch policy delivered and power switch policy evolution. Policy delivered looks at delivering current policy as was in 2006, and policy evolution looks at additional policies to be introduced. So we can see the fuel price comparison on the presentation on the left. You can see the gas and coal prices. These are exogenous assumptions that were put into the model as inputs. Electricity demand growth. So you can see there's obviously a massive variation in what was assumed to be growth in electricity demand between 2006 and 2010. It's a large variation, but some consistency in assumptions. So if you look at the DTI 2006 with measures compared to the ILEX PS2, which is the equivalent of the ILEX with measures. So here we go to the results. So this is coal and gas generation. So we can see on the left, DTI and the FOE, their maximum assessment of their coal generation in 2010 is roughly what happened, whereas the ILEX BAU case is much higher than what they assumed. Nuclear generation, so considering that the FOE study and the DTI study both assumed no new nuclear capacity and were gradually drawing down their nuclear generation. CO2 emissions from the power sector, again, as we assume there's only a 4-year difference between when they conducted the study and the 2010 horizon, you would think that there should be a relatively equal estimation of emissions from the electricity sector, but there's quite a variation. So even the ILEX business as usual scenario predicted about 150 megatons of CO2, but the actual value exceeded that, even considering between 2006 and 2010 there was a financial crash which reduced emissions across the board.
In this moment, UK is currently in transition to become a net energy importer. We have various energy policies in UK. So we have Energy White Paper, which was published in May 2007. We have Low Carbon Transition Plan of July 2009. And we have Energy Bill 2012 and 2013. Part of the Energy White Paper, the energy policy, do mention that we need 35 gigawatts of new electricity generation capacity over the next 2 decades. And the Energy Bill that aims to close a number of coal and nuclear power stations over the next 2 decades. We have facts and opportunities. A fifth of Britain's power capacity is scheduled to close in the next decade. Then we have this decline in the North Sea oil and gas. So global markets are also more volatile and pricey. The government recently issued about 197 new licenses for oil and gas exploration, and that is the largest number since 1967. Then recently we have the story of shale gas. The exact potential is unknown. In terms of development opportunities, the government promised of building 40 new gas power stations. So it's very, very difficult to do scenarios if we try to take into account politics. We have yin and yang, contrary forces. We come up with 2 alternative scenarios, the cauldron of contradictions which will work together as yin and yang. So we gave 2 names, Zorba and Kalinka. So Zorba, a Greek dance, is considered as a way of life, authentic integration of mind, body, and spirit. Kalinka is a Russian song, so it has a speedy tempo, light-hearted, and cheerful lyrics. So the dances accompanying Kalinka song are a series of varied steps, depending on the choreographer, the region, and the company performing them. The question is, what kind of dance should policymakers practice in their work? Kalinka is a predominant fossil fuels with CCS and nuclear. So that is a short-term priority security, affordability, so prevents stress of immediate technological revolution. The key drivers for this scenario story is recovering economic growth and meeting short-term demand, and then well-known technologies dispatchable, but CCS is not well known yet, so with the limited carbon reduction in short term. Zorba is more predominant renewables with storage. So it encourage long-term and security and environmental issues and need of a rapid uptake of renewables. The key drivers achieve environmental goals, a long-term economic growth with significant investments by 2030, and with support from the government for development of low carbon technologies and high investment in energy storage. Time horizon from 2020 to 2050. I put 2020 in black. It's full of uncertainties, it's full of opportunities, but we don't really know what to do with them. 2040, so is in red, and it's mainly because policies makers will need to devise, implement, and commit to policy. 2040 is going to be blue, like the sky. Then by 2050 is a green one, so we become green together. Within the triangle, policymakers need to ask several questions. What are the main needs of a country? What are the economic goals? What industry do we need to support over the next 20 years? Where are the investments needed? Which instruments will choose to address these needs? Kalinka is predominant fossil fuels, plans for nuclear and some shale gas. So it's mainly the situation in this moment. Then by 2040, energy security has been reinforced with fossil fuels, a nuclear capacity installed. Then we have a moderate but fast installations of renewables. So we are going to achieve a 45 reductions in CO2. Then by 2040, we have an increased proportion of CCS. Storage technologies start to be established. So we are going to achieve a 60% reduction in CO2. Zorba, we have in 2020 generation mix. Transmission is a key, enable connecting and balancing new, diverse sources of energy. Securing offshore wind is critical. By 2040, electricity demand will increase, driven by electrical cars and heat pumps. Gas and oil demand will decline. And then we have a distribution network capacity, which significantly will increase. And then we have some nuclear capacity, which remains as a backup. By 2040, carbon capture and storage is deployed at significant scale. We'll try to calibrate to different economic growth rates, projection of international commodity prices also, and other assumptions such as cost and penetration of technologies.
This dynamic modelling is at the whole national energy system level, and so this dynamic is important over periods of minutes and hours, but also, of course, across the season. So again, we have winter, spring, summer, autumn, and our demands co-varying with the weather. So we see here the space heat load declines. As we come into the summer, we're getting some air conditioning coming in here, the light blue, and so on. And at the same time, our renewable supplies are fluctuating. And these purple patches here are where there's not enough renewable energy, so we're having to generate it ourselves or import it. And to accomplish this dynamic system management, we have an aggregate heat store, the orange, and an aggregate electricity store, the red. We have to control the whole system. It's all interconnected. You know, there's no electricity bone unconnected to the rest of the body. All the parts are connected. We have to look in space and time. So here's a mock-up animation of a kind of future UK system. And now we have these demand centres here. And the demand is varying hour by hour during the day. That's the negative on this graph. And we have wind farms. We have a tidal scheme here. There's De Norwich pump storage going up and down. We have wave power, hydro, and so on. And these things are varying, and so the flows across the network are going to be fluctuating as well. So we have to balance this in space and time. The conclusions are, well, we have to consider whole system dynamics from minutes to years, as driven by people, weather, and technologies. And then we need to optimize the configuration of the whole system and the control strategy at the same time. And so, of course, the work that Catalina and other colleagues and myself do is really critical. To stakeholders to try and design these systems and explore the benefits and risks of different
configurations and pathways.
We are the coal industry. For Zorba, policy one, which is blindingly obvious, is that we want to see a full-scale demonstration in the UK, that means probably 400 megawatts plus of coal power station with carbon capture and storage. This should probably be a post-combustion plant, because that's probably what can be implemented most quickly in the UK. The plant should be in operation by 2020, and by 2020 the government should have committed itself to a program of coal plant with CCS. Policy B is there are three main routes to carbon capture and storage. Post-combustion, where you basically take the carbon dioxide off the back of the conventional coal station, oxy-fueling, where you burn the coal in oxygen, and IGCC, where you gasify the coal before you burn it. It's very important that all three of those routes be demonstrated, partly because we need to know which is the most efficient. So the government should commit a lot of money to, quantified, international collaboration to make sure that there is similar early demonstration by 2020 of those two other routes.
The first one is subsidies for gas storage to help with the intermittency of dealing with more renewables. So at the moment, even in today's situation, the storage potential for gas for reasonably rapid response is reaching its limit, so we need more storage capacity because there's going to be more need for storage because of the intermittent renewables. Policy B is more money into R&D for carbon capture and storage. The hydrogen that's produced by pre-combustion CCS would either be fed into open cycle gas turbines for fast response or combined cycle for mid-merit plant, or injected into the gas network. Policy B is to divert any CCS R&D money purely to pre-combustion CCS and forget post-combustion. But again, we would support the idea of an early stage, really big demo. Being the gas industry, we've got this wonderful thing called shale gas, which is going to make us all very happy and very rich. So we want subsidies to help with rapid commercialization and the exploration of shale gas as well. So we want lots of support for the industry on that.
The first policy that our industry would like to ask for is that in the Zorba scenario, we would like to maximise the operating lifetime of our existing plant. And what's more, we would like to make sure that we have a secure price until the end of that operating lifetime. For new plant, we want to make sure that we have strong financial incentives for 40-year with a 40-year guaranteed price and access to international markets for the power that we produce. We would like not to have any financial responsibility for waste, and we'd like freedom from normal planning restrictions for optimising siting. Once again, we want to ensure that a long operating lifetime for our existing plant, please, with a secure price again till the end of their operating life. And we would also like to build in some R&D into the system so that over the longer term, we know that nuclear and renewables could work together and together exclude the need for any other forms of power generation.
We decided we'd have the same three policies for Zorba and Kalinka, but we might skew the times a little bit. Our first policy, Policy A, is a feed-in tariff plus a renewables target, and we're going to pass irrevocable legislation that it's going to last for 50 years. So the investors have certainty of the target, and anyone who doesn't fill it will be shot in some way.